Hello, everyone. Well, welcome to our Centre for the Study of International Slavery event this afternoon. My name's Dr. Richard Benjamin. I'm a senior lecturer in contemporary museum practice at the University of Liverpool. I'm also co-director of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. And it's a great honour today to have Professor Martin Munro as our guest speaker. Before I introduce Martin, with a short biography, just to say that you will be able to send us questions during Martin's talk and shortly afterwards as well, and we will try to go through as many of those questions we can at the end of Martin's talk. So a few words about our guest today. Martin is Winthrop King Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Florida State University, and is a specialist in Francophone Caribbean literature and culture, with a particular interest in post-colonial theory, writing in exile in Francophone cultures, rhythm in Francophone literatures and cultures, and Caribbean sound studies. Now, Martin's previously worked in Scotland, Ireland, and indeed Trinidad. His publications include Different Drummers, Rhythm and Race in the Americas, 2010, Writing on the Fault Line, Haitian Literature and the Earthquake of 2010, and Tropical Apocalypse, Haiti and the Caribbean, End Times, and that's 2015. Also in 2021, he was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. His latest monographs are Listening to the Caribbean, Sounds of Slavery, Revolt and Race, 2022, and The Music of the Future, Sound and Vision in the Caribbean, 2024. And let me add here, Martin, that I think that the premise on the back cover of your book, Listening to the Caribbean, is particularly pertinent as it captures the aims and ideals of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery, and I think all good scholarship. And it notes the primary aim of Listening to the Caribbean, Sounds of Slavery, Revolt and Race is quite ambitious: to open up the Caribbean to a sound studies approach and to thereby effect a shift in Caribbean studies away from the predominantly visual biases of most scholarly works and towards a fuller understanding of early Caribbean societies through, and I think this is a very, very powerful line, listening into the past. So with that, over to our guest, Professor Martin Munro.
Morning, everyone. I just need to share my screen. Well, I'll share it in a minute, but just to say thank you to Richard for his kind introduction, to Mary and everyone at the Centre for their invitation. It's a great honour to be here online, of course, but I know Liverpool quite well. I've been to the museum many times, and yeah, it's a great honour to be invited to talk about this book, which of course came out with Liverpool University Press 2 years ago. So what I'm going to do is basically going to talk about some of the ideas that led me to this project. As Richard said, I'm mainly a literature scholar. I'm not really an historian, so that will be reflected in the presentation and in the kinds of works that have inspired me in my sound studies books so far. So yeah, let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, good. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to read, and as Richard says, please feel free to ask questions at the end, comments, so they'll be very welcome. So I'm going to start in Cayenne, French Guiana, 10th of May, 1751, where a Jesuit priest writes a letter to a colleague in France about the work of the mission on the edge of the South American mainland, a hot and inhospitable outpost of the empire. A 24-year resident of the colony, Father Foch is there for the salvation of souls, he says, which is part of the mission's enterprise of charity. The wealth of the French inhabitants of South America consists principally, he says, in their Negro slaves who are procured in Guinea and transported directly to our islands, as he puts it. The trade is very lucrative, and there is a great profit to be made on the sale of a full-grown man taken from Senegal and sold in Cayenne. Fox seems largely untroubled by the workings of the slave trade, except for the way in which the sale of newly arrived enslaved persons takes place in Cayenne. The captain of the ship hires a large warehouse where gather the French planters ready to inspect and purchase the individuals that suit them. How sad it is, Fox says, for a man of reason and susceptible of sentiment and reflection to see his fellow creatures sold in this fashion, like beasts of burden. He wonders what it is that white people have done for God that they should be spared the fate of the enslaved Africans. Accustomed to living in liberty and brutalized by the French, many of the enslaved run away, become Maroons, living in the vast forested hinterland, bringing disorder to the colony and to the efficient functioning of the plantation economy. To combat this and to regulate the enslaved population, Fox says, the French monarchy has instituted a code that prescribes a specific punishment for each commission of the crime of fleeing the plantations. The first time an enslaved person runs away, they are to have their ears cut off and be branded on the back with a fleur-de-lis. The second time, they will be hamstrung, and the third will result in hanging. Such punishments do not, however, prevent significant numbers of the enslaved from running away. The Maroons remain a threat to the plantation, just as they do to the Dutch planters in Suriname, where there are great numbers of Maroons in the forests. To save Cayenne from a similar evil, he says, the French send a large detachment of troops and militia into the woods and mountains, which manages to capture 3 or 4 Maroons, one of whom was killed. Given such a meager return, the French governor sends a second detachment, and this time Fox judges that it would be in accordance with their ministry for the priests to accompany the soldiers. He believes he might save the bodies and souls of the Maroons, while at the same time bring back to the workshops a large number of slaves, whose absence caused the work to languish, he says. Eventually, Fox meets with some success. He leads back to Cayenne a group of around 50 Maroons, for whom he obtains a pardon from the governor so that they are spared the punishment set out in the code he refers to. And yet, as he concedes at the end of his letter, not all of the Maroons who had promised him they would give themselves up do so. The enslaved continue to run away from the plantations, and the Maroon communities persist as a permanent corollary of the plantation, its inverted reflection and fated consequence. So the set of rules and laws governing the ownership of slaves that Fox refers to is, of course, the notorious Code Noir of 1685. The 1685 edicts issued by Louis XIV, of which Article 38 prescribes the punishment for escaping the plantation. The cropping of ears had long been used as a punishment in Europe, and alongside other measures such as pillorying and branding. I'm actually going to read this just so that it is clear what is involved here. The fugitive slave who has been on the run for 1 month from the day his master reported him to the police shall have his ears cut off and shall be branded with a fleur-de-lis on one shoulder. If he commits the same infraction for another month, again counting the day he is reported, he shall have his hamstring cut and be branded with a fleur-de-lis on the other shoulder. The third time, he shall be put to death. So this is Article 38 of the Code Noir. And as I was saying, this cropping of ears had long been used as a punishment in Europe alongside other measures such as pillorying and branding. In the colonial Americas, Puritan authorities sought to stifle Quaker rhetoric, and those who refused to be silenced would have their ears cut off and finally have their tongues bored through with a hot iron. While the punishment's primary aim was to physically disfigure the victim, many of those so inflicted in 17th century New England were convicted of slighting or other speech offences, and thus there is a suggestive link between ear cropping and seeking to stifle speech and hearing, and thereby maintain the social order. There is a similarly suggestive link between ear cropping in colonial French Guiana and the desire to inhibit the hearing, speech, and communication of the enslaved in general, and the Maroons in particular. In a hostile, forbidding, and unfamiliar environment such as the forests and mountains of inland Guyana, the ability to hear clearly was a matter of life and death. Indeed, when Falk ventures into that environment, he makes several references to sounds and hearing as vital aspects of his attempts to navigate the space and make contact with the Maroons. Notably, he uses, without knowing its name, a conch shell, and I quote, which they employ here in place of a bell to give the Negroes the signal to rise, to mark the hours of labor, end quote. And repeated blasts on which fail to bring the Maroons into his presence. He seems unaware of the irony that any Maroon punished already by ear cropping would have difficulty in hearing the sound of the shell. It is sound, or indeed its absence, that most affects him on his journey into the forests. He finds himself in a state of total abandonment, he says, full of dread and without any succor in the profound silence that reigned there. He feels that though the Maroons do not respond to the sound of the shell, they nonetheless can see him. Wishing to assure them of his motives, he shouts with all his force, he says, into the silence of the forest, again to no avail. For Falk, therefore, it is sound, silence, and hearing that are the primary means of reaching out to the Maroons, while for the Maroons the same phenomena are vital ways of remaining unseen, unheard, and free. To have one's ears cropped is to reduce greatly the capacity to live and remain free in the forests. And the fact that this is the first punishment inflicted on any escapee suggests the authorities' awareness of the importance of hearing and sound to becoming and remaining free, and by implication that the control of these phenomena was of primary importance to the colonial regime. Indeed, the significance of sound and noise in the effective control of the enslaved is further suggested in Article 16 of the Code Noir. Article 16, I'll read it. In the same way we forbid slaves belonging to different masters to gather in the day or night, whether claiming for wedding or otherwise, whether on their master's property or elsewhere, and still less in the main roads or faraway places on pain of corporal punishment, which will not be less than the whip and the fleur-de-lis, and which, in case of frequent violations and other aggravating circumstances, can be punished with death. This we leave to the decision of the judges. We charge all our subjects to approach offenders to arrest them and take them to prison, even if they are not officers, and it's not yet any decree against them. Clearly then, Black Assembly, especially noisy, festive Black Assembly, was a threat to the plantation system, and the more the French could limit the opportunities for the enslaved to create noise, the better chance they had of maintaining order. France was far from alone in imposing such sound and hearing related decrees and punishments on the enslaved people of the Caribbean. In Jamaica, the British introduced the first comprehensive slave code in 1664 and placed almost no limits on the slaveholder's power to correct his or her slaves, to the extent that in the event of an enslaved person dying in the course of punishment, no person shall be accountable to any law, the code said. In 1767, 2 enslaved men found guilty of various crimes were given 78 lashes each and had their right ears severed close to their heads and nailed to the cotton tree. Virtually every punishment ordered by the courts involved the public infliction of pain on the body of the convict, so that punishment was a spectacle, almost an entertainment that brought permanent disfigurement to the enslaved. And I quote Diana Payton here, "Some suffered the scarring inflicted by flogging, others the even more painful and permanent disfigurement of the loss of one or both ears," end quote. In one case, 2 men convicted of stealing a parcel of cured coffee were sentenced to have their right ears cut off and to receive 60 lashes. Women were not spared such punishments. One runaway had both ears cut off, was placed in chains and sentenced to be lashed every month for a year. There is a precision in the sentences involving mutilation that suggests a particular interest in the ears and the degree of mutilation to be inflicted. As Payton says again, quote, The court always specified whether the right ear or the left ear was to be cut off. The lower part of an ear was to be cut off in some cases, while in others the court directed that the ears were to be cut off close to the convict's head. End quote. In all, the slave court records detail what Peyton calls the symbolics of mutilation that bears investigation. For Peyton, the Jamaican practice of cropping ears recalls the 1723 Virginia slave code for perjury by slaves. Ears were nailed to the pillory and then cut off. Peyton perceptively considers the Jamaican practice of carrying out punishments by near to cotton trees, which are highly significant in Jamaican Obeah cosmology, and which he says may have been chosen by whites to suggest their symbolic power over the enslaved and their Obeah beliefs. As Peyton describes it, the cotton tree was a receptacle for the stolen shadows of believers, one part of their spiritual being that could be released by placing ritual objects there. While the precise symbolics of the mutilation of ears near to cotton trees are vague and no doubt multifaceted, it seems reasonable to consider that the tree was alive in some way to the believers, that it spoke to them, and it was a vital means of connecting with the afterlife, including the dead. To have one's ears cropped at such a place of communication between the dead and the living would seem to be a cruel means of interrupting that communication. And the particular prevalence of ear cropping as a punishment in Jamaica, as in French Guiana, suggests an awareness on behalf of the whites of the importance of hearing and sound to Black cosmology, culture, and being in the Caribbean. As Vincent Brown notes, citing a case in which a murdered white man's ear is found in his enslaved assassin's house, Obeah belief held that, quote, as long as the murderer possesses one of the ears of his victim, he will never be haunted by a spectre, end quote. On the other hand, the mutilations employed by the whites were highly visual in nature, public displays that dramatized the power of the masters, and that alongside the highly visual symbolics of race, the dualism of whiteness and blackness, asserted the visual power of the whites, the sense that white power exists principally in the seen world, and that attempts to enforce that power would often be visual in nature and involve the disruption of the auditory cultures of the enslaved. Indeed, in Fox's account of his expedition into the Guyanese forests and mountains, just as his blasts on the conch shell were met with no response, his shouted pleas to the Maroons to give themselves up fail, and not one of these miserable beings appear, as he says. When, however, he gives up his vocal supplications to the Maroons and introduces a visual symbol, before he leaves, he erects a cross of a kind of hardwood, the effect is immediate. And I quote from Fox, as soon as the Negro Maroons saw the cross, they came there to say their prayers, it being their custom, notwithstanding their reckless wickedness, to pray to God morning and evening, end quote. As Fox realizes, it is the visual symbol of the cross that was the means of rendering his enterprise successful. He learns later that as soon as the Maroons saw, quote, the sign of our redemption set upon their ground, they were at length convinced that the time had come to obtain pardon, both for their souls and their bodies, end quote. Fox is perceptive enough to question whether salvation was the Maroons' real motive. But he does return to Cayenne with 50 Maroons and holds that it was the visual effect of the cross that inspired the Maroons to give themselves up. The visually based power of the French is further suggested in Fox's account of the Maroon children who, having been born in the forests, have never seen, quote, any white person or the house of a Frenchman and were never tired of observing them while, according to their fashion, they manifested their admiration, end quote. Thus, the effect of seeing the cross is compounded by the sight of the white people and their homes in a kind of visual trinity of French colonialism, the church, the white race, and the material wealth of the French are all too visible signs of power, to which even the Maroons surrender, and which form the basis of colonial authority. The 17th century Maroons' awareness of the visual power of the Europeans, of the whites' more or less complete control of the seen world, and the ability that control conveys to determine lived reality, is no isolated instance in Caribbean history, as is suggested in the cases analysed by Peyton above. nor is it a primitive or unsophisticated or even superstitious understanding of the power relations between the Europeans and others in colonial Guyana. Indeed, one finds centuries later in the most sophisticated Caribbean thought examples of largely the same visual conflict between those designated as whites and blacks. So this next. This next slide is from Frantz Fanon, Peau Noir, Masque Blanc, quite famous passages from that book. Okay, so Frantz Fanon's account of his encounter with a young French boy who calls, "Maman, look, a Negro, I'm scared," is perhaps the best known example of such a visual encounter. Realizing, as he puts it, that he's an object among other objects, Fanon appeals to the white other, quote, "so that his liberating gaze, gliding over my body, suddenly smooth of rough edges, would put me back in the world," end quote. And yet the other persists, quote, "He fixes me with his gaze, his gestures and attitude, the same way you fix a preparation with a die," end quote. When he and other blacks were given the occasion to confront the white gaze, an unusual weight descended on us, he says, which is the weight of the fixed racial idea of blacks held by European whites, and which is in effect a remarkably intact continuation of that experience by the 17th century Maroons in Guyana. The power dynamics around sight, seeing, and being seen are also a preoccupation for Edouard Glissant in, for example, his poetic intention, Intention poétique, where in a section on Michel Leiris, he writes, this is the next quotation from Glissant, and I'll read it. "We hate ethnography. Whenever executing itself elsewhere, it does not fertilize the dramatic vow of relation. The distrust that we feel toward it comes not from the displeasure at being watched, but from the resentment at not watching in return, and not for its weaning us from the satisfaction of equivalence, but for its obfuscation and ransacking, at least as it's practiced, of the richness of all relations, of this relationship, the world at last alive, suffered, shared." For Glissant, the European ethnographer inherits the slave master's power to define the seen world, to be always the one who sees and who is rarely the object of the gaze of the black other. The gaze of the ethnographer, moreover, obscures and obfuscates. The more the look is one way and never returned, the less it clarifies and the more it undermines relation. He quotes Leiris's own frustrations with the visual nature of ethnography from Leiris. "Thus envisioned, it could only disappoint me. A human science remains a science, and detached observation could not alone beget contact," end quote. Glissant writes of the need to move beyond observation, as he puts it, and tend toward broader intentions in the practice of ethnography. And as Maeve McCusker notes, she's writing about Glissant here, quote, "The colonial subject's desire is not to escape the master's gaze, but to participate in the scopic exchange on equal terms. And modern Caribbean writing in general is an attempt to reverse the intrinsic inequality and lack of reciprocity of a relationship in which historically those who were seen could not themselves see those who see them," end quote. In his epic 1964 novel, Le Quatrième Siècle, the Fourth Century, published just 5 years before Poetic Intention, Glissant explores the memory and legacy of slavery and is similarly interested in the power of the master's gaze, which, as McCusker again says, quote, "constructed not just as a vector of his supremacy, but indeed its very source," end quote. It's no doubt significant in the novel that it is the Maroon figure Longueuil who is most keenly aware of the power of the master's gaze. These are quotations from this, from Le Quatrième Siècle. This is Longueuil, referring to Longueuil. "The master did not really exist when he was looking at you," the narrator writes, "as if he could only rule by establishing a flow that dried up as soon as he turned away," end quote. It is no less significant that Longway is the only black character in the novel who dares to hold and even return the master's gaze. The white master, an absolute and maniacal patriarch, spreads fear with his, quote, gaze that made them all sons, employees, slaves, and freedmen shiver, end quote. Sitting high on his steed, La Roche, the master, appears as an omniscient power, all-seeing and able to instill terror on all who come into his line of vision. He would stare thoughtfully at those who had incurred his anger, so that his sons become more fearful than ever of his fixed stare. His ocular power is emphasized even in his exchanges with fellow planters. In one scene, he looked the planter up and down without a word, and the foolish man fell silent. As McCusker writes again, quote, in all these respects, he conforms to the type of the all-powerful because all-seeing planter, the embodiment of absolute colonial power, end quote. And as she writes of Glisson's maroon figure, Longway, it is through meeting and returning the master's gaze that the master-slave power relationship can be altered. Indeed, it is this ability that frees Longway even as he arrives in Martinique. And this is a quote from McCusker again. The fact that Longway, while still aboard the slave ship, holds the colon's gaze immediately signals the soon-to-be Maroon's unique status, even as fellow planters are subjugated by La Roche's stare, and his exceptional capacity for resistance. This exchange of looks establishes their relationship as a power dynamic, founded on exchange and reciprocity, and inaugurates a series of unconventional encounters that seal the pact between Master Maroon and Maroon's descendants, end quote. Implicitly, too, for a Caribbean author such as Glisson, the ability to write back to the colonial master and to European literary tradition involves a willingness to hold the white European gaze and to enter into the kind of pact Longway does, one that does not deny the truth of slavery and domination, but that shows that different kinds of relationships are possible, and that these necessitate an awareness of the visual power of the master. So it should already becoming clear that racism is largely, though not exclusively, a visual affair, a matter of seeing and classifying the other through looking and the power of the gaze. Writing specifically of the United States, Jennifer Lynn Stover states that, quote, race in America is a visual phenomenon. Americans have long understood race as expressed through attitudes about skin color and visual phenotypical differences, and the power differentials resulting from an ideological racialized visual gaze. In a Caribbean context, when the Haitian poet Rodney Stantiellois writes of the best lesson, as he puts it, he has had about racism, he cites an example from a novel written by his fellow Haitian, Jean-Claude Charles. Stantiellois describes a scene at once terrible and sarcastic set in New York City from Charles's 1985 novel, Manhattan Blues. The black narrator at a museum with a white woman. They embrace. It's almost a cliche, he admits, but everything gets complicated when the white museum attendant sees the couple kiss and disapproves. It is, Stantiellois says, quote, through the gaze that everything happens, a gaze full of hatred which annihilates the couple and the kiss, end quote. This is an example, Stantiellois says, of what Charles names, quote, the racism of the gaze, end quote, which to illustrate further, he quotes the following passage from the novel. This is from this novel that I mentioned from 1985, Manhattan Blues by Jean-Claude Charles. And I quote, the racism of a look is the biggest giveaway there is. It does not speak, it does not strike, it does not emit audible insults. It's there, and its addressee cannot be in any doubt about it. It's a feeling that no one who is not discriminated against can experience, because it's not part of their experience of the world. It's not accounted for in any analysis, it's not dissected, there is no law, nor should there be any law against it. This is not about paranoia. Usually I either don't pay attention or I don't care, end quote. Okay, and the quote carries on, I suppose women have felt the unspeakable thing about or under certain circumstances, or Arabs in France, or Jews, or anyone who has been at risk of being raped, lynched, beaten, gassed. One can never say, Monsieur, Madame, your gaze is harmful to. There's no clear code in this matter. It's a matter of skin, so to speak, a matter of guts. The look of a racist grabbed by the gut. End quote. In effect, Charles's narrator sees, experiences, feels the same gaze as Glisson's maroon figure feels from the slave master, and that Foch and the planters used as a weapon in their attempts to control the enslaved in 17th century French Guiana. That a modest museum attendant in late 20th century New York can brandish the same gaze, and that the gaze's power is undiminished, suggests the ways in which white racism remains grounded in the visual, in the silent look that yet speaks of hundreds of years of prejudice and discrimination. As the primary vector by means of which racism is constructed and has perpetuated itself over centuries, the visual places particular emphasis on the Black body as a visceral, immediate, yet complex sign to white racists. The sight of a Black man embracing a white woman hits the museum attendant in the guts, almost instinctively. That the kiss and the reaction take place in an art museum suggests the white man's racism has to do with the Black man's access to art as much as to the women. Both are implicitly the property of the white man. And the coming together of the white and Black bodies in that space offends and disrupts the sense of propriety that the attendant is there to safeguard. It is no coincidence that, given his sensitivity to the visual grounding and transmission of white racism, Jean-Claude Charles, again, is one of the most perceptive, profound, and vital, if also unread and ignored, thinkers on race. His masterful essay, Le Corps Noir, published first in 1980, is an overlooked yet strikingly contemporary and relevant critique of the myth of race and its attachment to visual representations of the Black body. In her analysis of the text, Jasmine Claude Narcisse contextualizes Charles' work in relation to the long history of white racism. And that's the next quotation from Narcisse. Jean-Claude Charles' Le Corps Noir reveals itself in the unbearable tension between the revolted tightening of a body, black, caged, and the despairing solitude of the denial of this body, mass-produced by a colonial construct, then by a nigrophilic myth. From the first definition in the Encyclopédie, 1765, long before Gobineau's theories of racial inequality, 1848, and even longer before anthropology and ethnology made it their purpose to study the particularities of races, to Stanislas Adotevi through Alain Locke and Frantz Fanon, we have watched this body over and over, worldly, bemarked, displayed, justified, deconstructed, rejected, refurbished at the expense of its simple humanity. End quote. As Narcisse suggests, what is challenging and singular about Charles is that for all his awareness of the historical construction of Blackness, he seeks no comfort in redemptory visions of the same Black bodies in the nigrophilic myths offered by white negrophiles, as they put it, or by Black intellectual and political movements such as negritude. Rather than attacking racism through seeking to reverse or overturn negative images and ideas attached to Blackness, Charles instead attacks the notion of difference itself. He critiques the French government organization of a week of dialogue between French people and immigrants, which is itself based on the point of view that, quote, racism, when it exists, is linked to the non-recognition, the non-respect for difference, end quote. The week of dialogue involved, Charles says, quote, rulers, reactionaries who have seen the light, staunch progressives, unquestionable Democrats, and right down to the platitudes of my neighbors who come together in concern that my difference not be violated. It is, end quote, it is, he said, an odd way for a long-standing notion to end up. He's talking about race. Quote, a curious destiny for a problem introduced by Montaigne, continued by Rousseau, resituated in modern anthropology and used more or less effectively against tendencies to make things uniform, homogeneous, orthodoxies, against the universalist grinding down of humanism set with all sorts of traps, cultural and social standardization, and today working against the very diversities that we will have served to bring to light. End quote. Questioning the notion of difference, Charles wonders whether it itself is, in fact, a mass of received ideas that circulate across discourses that are sympathetic to Black people. Quote, in this negrophilia, which is to classical racism what assistance is to social exclusion, an aggravating factor which reinforces the same through good faith, a final blow through a flaw in people's thinking or through unconscious intentionality, end quote. Charles says that the black question needs to be renamed by all who are invested in it, including and even primarily what he calls the shopkeepers of negritude, who are involved in, quote, the macabre carnival of racial difference and are ever ready to brandish their specificities in a uniform rustling of checks, a tom-tom of transnational capital, end quote. This is to Charles a deathly noise to which the West can remain oblivious, as that is the price for its existence. The black body exists in this discourse of race as an invention and an object of exchange, and black people themselves participate in this fantasized idea of human difference. Tellingly, Charles evokes vision and the lasting power of the master's gaze as the forces that oversee this enduring myth of race. Black people take part in the myth, he says, quote, through their multiple bodies that the master's eye wishes to make one and to folklorize in the relentless work of ethnic othering, end quote. So I'll move on from Jean-Claude Charles. I'll talk about a couple of other influential theorists. And in her work, her influential work, Saidiya Hartman writes similarly of an enduring racist optics that gives black suffering a spectral, unreal character. Mediated through white writers, even if those writers profess to abhor the violence, black suffering may appear naturalized and fixed in a way that, she says, effaces and restricts black sentience. If it is necessary in order to appeal to sentiment or morality to bring the violence close, Hartman argues that in doing so, the suffering is dissipated. It is the closeness of the seeing eye that dissipates the suffering, for, in the phrase of Zygmunt Bauman, quote, morality conforms to the law of optical perspective. It looms large and thick close to the eye, end quote. In the case of violence towards the enslaved, the suffering remains elusive, as it is brought near only by way of a proxy, the white writer's indignation and imagination, as Hartman puts it. If the black body is the vehicle of the other's power, pleasure, and profit, Hartman writes, then it's also true that it's the white body, specifically the eye, that, quote, makes the captive's suffering visible and discernible, end quote. The white eye sees in this sense without seeing, and the elusive nature of black suffering can be attributed to, quote, the racist optics in which black flesh is itself identified as the source of opacity, the denial of black humanity, and the effacement of sentience integral to the wanton use of the captive body. There is to this end quote. There is to this optics of white morality, quote, a repressive underside that insists upon the other as a mirror of the self, and that in order to recognize suffering, must substitute the self for the other, end quote. Black suffering cannot therefore just be, it must be recuperated, explained, brought close visually in a way that only compounds the effects of the physical violence. The effacing violence of the white eye used as a filter for sentiment and morality, completes the work of the torturer by bearing witness to the spectacle of suffering, and thereby, as Hartman puts it, quote, slipping into the black body and figuratively occupying the position of the enslaved, end quote. The suffering is at once visible and invisible, and this is due to the crisis of witnessing that Hartman writes of, created ultimately by the visual power of the whites. The enslaved are legally incapable of bearing witness against whites, so seeing embodies and actuates power on the plantation and in present-day society. The master's eye endures, therefore, from early colonial times to the present. It is an eye that considers itself omniscient, rational, and clear, and yet it reproduces the most fantastic, invented, obscure notions of human difference. The scholar Nicholas Mirzoeff writes of the ways in which the modern visual culture began with a major shift in the mid-17th century in what he calls the European division of the sensible. I'll just quote a little bit from Mirzoeff. Drawing on Foucault, he argues that in this new formation of the senses, quote, there was a gap between things and words, a gap that could be crossed by seeing, a form of seeing that would dictate what it was possible to say. There was a new set of priorities attached to sensory perception. Taste and smell became less important. now being understood as imprecise. Hearsay was simply excluded, while touch was limited to a series of binary distinctions, end quote. The new sensorial order of things was, Mirzoeff argues, produced by the needs of European expansion and encounter, above all in the plantation colonies. The subject by, for instance, the French Code Noir and the Barbados, excuse me. Okay. Okay, yeah, I'll just carry on. The slavery that interests Mirzoeff and also the book, my book, is not so much that of the metaphysical condition of the enslaved, as in Hegel, for instance, but what Mirzoeff calls, quote, the legally regulated, visually controlled, hyper-violent condition of forced labor in Atlantic world cash crop plantations. The ordering of slavery was a combination of violent enforcement and visualized surveillance that sustained the new colonial order of things, end quote. The term oversight is used by Mirzoeff to describe the visually based system of control in the plantations. Quote again, it created a regime of taxonomy, observation, and enforcement that came to be known as economy. It maintained a delineated space in which all life and labor were directed from its central viewpoint because the production of colonial cash crops, especially sugar, required a precise discipline centered on surveillance while being dependent on spectacular and excessive physical punishment, end quote. Oversight was not completely a successful enterprise, however, largely because of the resistance of the enslaved and their creation of what Mirzoeff calls a counter-theater to the system of surveillance and discipline. This counter-theater, as Mirzoeff puts it, was, by contrast to the visually controlled world of oversight, full of noise, the voices and sounds that were never silenced and that ever challenged the regime of the eye. What then about the ear, the world of sounds that in Fox's account the Maroons and the enslaved seem to exist in more freely, and which appears to be less susceptible to the control of the whites? The book that I'm talking about today is motivated by and turns around that idea that from the earliest days of slavery, there was in the Caribbean something of a war of the senses, a relentless guerrilla war, chiefly, but not exclusively of sight and hearing, and that notions of race and difference were created to some degree around these two senses, according to which the eye and vision were the vectors for the power of the masters and for the invention of the ideas of blackness and whiteness on which that power depends. Classified, other, dehumanized, condemned, folklorized by this white visual power, the enslaved and their descendants have created sophisticated sonic worlds in which have persisted and thrived non-white cultures, ways of thinking and being and acting that resisted and escaped the all-seeing master's gaze. So, yeah, I'll come to my conclusion pretty quickly. So the book echoes and parallels to some degree the work of Stover, whom I referred to before, who, from her book, quote, connects sound with race in American culture, showing how listening operates as an organ of racial discernment, categorization, and resistance in the shadow of vision's alleged cultural dominance. So Stover, end quote, Stover further underscores the importance of sound as, quote, a critical modality through which subjects reproduce, apprehend, and resist imposed racial identities and structures of racist violence, end quote. However, in beginning to understand the apparent difference in sensorial experience and signification, one must also question it, and following Jean-Claude Charles, be wary of the notion of difference itself, so that it never becomes anything other than an uncertain, slippery, invented, contingent idea that should not solidify into the absolute or the natural. One must, in other words, bear in mind Lee Eric Schmidt's pertinent observation that, quote, the identification of visuality as supremely modern and Western has also been sustained, most notably in the work of Marshall McLuhan, through the othering of the auditory as primitive or even African. The equation of modernity with its gaze has often upheld some of the most basic cultural oppositions of us and them. Arguing that such an association haunts 20th century writing. Sorry, my notes are a bit mixed up. Yeah, this echoes what Schmidt says it, and Stengel and Sykes, the two other sound theorists. Echoing Schmidt, Stengel and Sykes, note that from at least the time of Rousseau, quote, Western thought has associated sound with South. And arguing that such an association haunts 20th century writing, they propose that the first move in any discourse on sound is to denaturalize and de-essentialize it, end quote. So yeah, I'll just move to my conclusions here. There are other theorists such as Jude Soke, who writes about technology and sound, and Veit Earlman cautions on the simplistic nature of mapping an alternative economy of the senses in which prominence perforce must be given to the neglected second sense, end quote. It's not enough, Earlman writes, to denounce vision and replace it with a new sensibility based on the ear, end quote. The work of this or any other book on non-Western sound must then, to use Stern's terms, challenge, quote, unthought pre-notions around sound, vision, and race in particular, and be a site where sonic imaginations go to be challenged, nurtured, refreshed, and transformed, end quote. One more slide. Yeah. Okay, so this book, in essence, begins to address two quite glaring absences, as I saw, in the primary fields of inquiry. It seeks to understand the importance of sound to Caribbean history, culture, and being, and in doing so, it hopes to contribute to understanding the ways in which the Caribbean should be a prime site for students of sound. And yeah, I'm going to stop there. It's just there's quite a lot of introductory material there, but I'd be very happy to hear any questions or comments on what I've presented. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Martin, very much. It's absolutely fascinating talk there.